This is Sam Long.
I'm John Nugent.
And I am Ron Peters.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
After class.
Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. Here we are at the end of our semester. We had our graduation commencement ceremony, and students have left, and now we sit around a lonely faculty wing and enjoy one another's company, which is kind of nice. But we thought we would do a little retrospective, maybe pick out a highlight from the year, something that we really enjoyed from this past year, somewhat school-related. So, Ron, you want to start us off?
Yeah. When John put this
Yeah.
out there, we all stared up at the ceiling and went, what do we want to talk about? At first, it seemed like a bad idea, but actually, we do have some highlights. And for me, one of them was the mission trip we took to the island of Kauai. We had a number of students go, young men, young women, and we spent a lot of time serving on the island in a variety of ways. And I was just really impressed with the amount of effort and the fantastic attitude they brought. I thought that they represented the kingdom well. I thought they represented Great Lakes really well. And I was just very, very proud of them. And that's the second year we've done this Kauai trip. And we're already talking about next year's, and I can't wait to go back and do it again. But I just can't say enough good things about our students. They represented so fantastically. I think that would probably that'd be right there at the top of all the good things that happened this year.
How's it you were in Hawaii? But that's fine.
Right.
I know, because we stayed at a hotel.
You were getting
and
sunshine, for instance.
played beach volleyball every day. And
It's
all that
February.
kind of
We're
stuff.
here. I mean, it's fine.
It was warm, but we were not staying at a resort. I always feel like I have to justify that we
Yeah,
went
you
to
do.
Hawaii
You do.
for a missions
I mean,
trip. We were not at a resort.
You've said that on the air 3 times now.
Yeah, we were not at yeah, because
be
people
clear.
keep throwing it back in my face.
Okay.
Once you understand how that feels, you'll understand.
Moving right
how it
along.
bonds.
When we get invited, we'll talk about it. Okay.
No problem.
I'm going to switch what I thought I was going to say.
Oh, here we go.
Oh, wow. All inaudible.
That way I left yours
No,
open
I'm
if you
good.
need to steal
Okay.
it.
I don't need to steal it. Give me a break.
One of my highlights was my small group. We did a coffee and Jesus small group, and it was cool. It was at my house, which was kind of nice to be able to have this bunch of students come over for small group and then kind of create the ambiance. And we tried all sorts of different coffees, and some students were learning it for the first time, and some were experimenting in ways they never had before. And Jordan Nichols pretty much led it, and I was, I guess, a name-only co-leader. Yeah, I provided the home and the record player. So anyway, it was a highlight because it was a nice rhythm to have in the middle of my week, and enjoyed that time with students. And I don't know, it may be my last small group for the foreseeable future, given how different roles are shifting. So yeah, it's a highlight.
Our listeners probably don't realize that you live really close to campus. Like, students can walk to your house very easily. Because some people may think, wow, they came all the way to your house. Where do you live? It's like, you live really close by, so it made it very convenient.
It's an easy walk, and they all drove.
Exactly.
And they all drove. Well, I guess that makes sense because it was winter most of the time.
Yes,
so
it is true.
I guess
It's still winter.
Yeah. When I would walk my dog, I would see all the cars in front of your house. I was walking, but they were not.
Oh, yep.
because you're a tougher man.
Amen.
Todd Jones,
Still hanging out.
still hanging out on the podcast, still a guest leader of our show.
They said still leggy. Like, okay, that's one description of Todd. But
What's your highlight?
Well, kind of twofold. I crossed the halfway point of my Doctor of Ministry program, which is pretty exciting. But the part that our students played in that is I conducted research on them. Cue hideous evil laughter. In one of our classes, I was able to start my research on my project. My final project is related to prayer. It's a long thing to unpack, but I was able to collect some feedback and get some initial reports, and it's good data. Not that they had a good experience or a bad experience, but that the data is clear, which is exactly what you need for the project. So I'm excited about that, and hopefully going to finish strong in this program.
you hook up like electrodes to their brains to see what electric shock does during prayer? Is that the sort of evidence you collected?
We did that just to see how they would react.
Yeah,
That wasn't
okay.
connected to the research. Yeah, that was
That's more
just,
for entertainment
Yeah,
purposes.
exactly.
Right? We're going to do a Ghostbusters thing here. So.
At Zapzone, they have one of those chairs that you sit in it like a throne, and there's these 2 electrodes or, 2 metal things that you grab, and it shocks you.
Until you let go.
So you could maybe use that for your next experiment.
I'll talk to my supervisor and
Hey,
see how we can work that
Pray,
in.
start praying, and we're going to turn this on.
We're going to see how long you can focus on God in the midst of this, electricity surging through your body.
They did make us take a course on ethical research practices
Sure.
before starting. I'm just going to throw that out there that Emmanuel is not to be held responsible for this ridiculous brainstorming session.
And he failed it, to be clear. Got to retake that at some point. For me, I think the highlight goes all the way back to the beginning of the year. So I teach Introduction to Biblical Interpretation, and it's the first class that a lot of students, freshmen, take, even transfers. And there were 60 students in it, which is a huge class.
Gosh.
And so that itself is exciting, although also daunting because it makes you have to adjust how you do things. But they were just really good and engaged. Like freshmen, you kind of come in and don't know what's going on. But it was just, for me, it was a really nice way to start the year because I'm like, oh, this freshman class seems to have it together on some levels. Others, obviously not because they're 18 years old. But it's just, for me, it's just an encouragement because they, like I said, they were engaged. They were there regularly. They're mostly on time. And it's not like it's overwhelming single thing that happened, but just going in, I looked forward to going to that class week after week because, there were 60 of them. I wouldn't say bright-eyed and bushy-tailed because it was 9 o'clock, but they were they were there and they were ready to learn. And so for me, it just set a good tone, and I think hopefully a good tone for the next 3 years. Hopefully students will continue on.
I'm impressed that you were able to do that as a single class. Like you didn't split it up into 2 classes.
I didn't have time,
Yeah.
but I really wanted to.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah.
I mean, 2 classes of 30 is a lot easier to manage than a
Yep,
single class
it
of
sure
60.
is,
Oh
but-
my gosh.
That's all right.
Yeah, I remember being a guest teacher in that class, and they were a special group.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
You didn't have to pull teeth. They were ready to talk.
yeah, they would answer questions as opposed to just like look at you blankly, like you guys do to me when I
Pretty
say
much, yeah.
things on the
I get
podcast.
that. Well,
Did you mention at the beginning that graduation happened?
I did.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it got me thinking about it. Like, we had award ceremonies at the end of the year, and so many more students made the dean's list
yeah,
than
that
has
was
it
great, too.
a long
ever
list.
happened. And I wonder if it's connected to this class. Like,
Yeah.
these students work, and they work hard, and we have this kind of sweet spot in the demographic where they're like taking their schoolwork seriously, and it's showing in terms of overall GPAs and the classroom experience.
Yep.
So,
Well, that's what I'd want to see because this year just had quiet students. They were good students, but you couldn't get them to talk. You ask questions in class, and it's just blank stares. And I kept telling them, "You are a really different class." I always have a few students who are willing to jump in and participate, and nobody was willing to do that. So, Sam, you're kind of making me look forward to
Yeah,
getting
next
this
year you
group
get 'em
up
all.
and- yeah, see them in class.
stupid COVID.
Let's just blame COVID for everything.
Sure,
I'm
why
good
not?
with that. I'm totally fine with that.
All right.
Well,
Oddly.
Yeah, well, now we all look at Todd.
making our move back toward the spiritual disciplines.
Yes.
We have reached number 8, which is a significant milestone because this is the last of the outward disciplines before we transition to the corporate disciplines. Probably say more about that distinction next time. But for now, we're going to be looking at service, the spiritual discipline of service. And so we'll launch right in, as is our custom, with Foster's definition. We'll kick it around a little bit and then see where we go. So Foster defines service as selfless acts done for others, rooted in humility and love rather than obligation or personal gain.
Okay. I'm supposed to say something now.
Well, I tell you, I feel a strong compulsion to do nothing but praise it. Because my buddy Larry told me how every time you give us a definition, he's like, you guys just jump all over it and rip it apart. I'm like, I think that's an over-exaggeration.
No, he's right.
But okay, I feel like I want to break that pattern by saying nothing but positive things about this definition. I don't know if I can do it.
Yeah, because the thing is, we got to keep in mind, we're talking about the spiritual discipline of service. All right, we're not just talking about random service, right? It's a spiritual discipline aspect. So adding in those qualifiers, I think, are important. I notice you have a pushback against it, and I mean, I was trying to
Gentle.
discuss that.
Yeah, gentle
You just
pushback.
say like, are selfish acts still service? And I would suggest that maybe the difference is, yes, they're service, but they're not the spiritual discipline of service. I don't know if that's a differentiation we can make or not. But it's this idea that you are willingly, and in the same way, I guess, for all the spiritual disciplines, like if you're going into prayer saying, oh, I got to do this, then what are we doing, right? If it's not this desire to empty self, draw near to God, then I guess it turns from not a discipline to just a thing. And so for me, I don't mind the qualifiers for that reason, but I do see what you're saying. Like, yeah, technically it's still service, but it may not be accomplishing the same goal if it's done selfishly or if it's done out of obligation.
Yeah, I can see that that definition depends on the perspective of the service. Like from the position of the people receiving the service, it's still service. Like you're serving me, I'm getting the benefit. And so they can call it service just fine because they're saying, I'm being served and I appreciate it. Thank you so much. But from the perspective of the person who's actually doing it, if you're bringing in this sort of selfish thing, then is it really an act of service? I always think of things like service and generosity as requiring a certain amount of sacrifice to them. Like if you're not giving something up, then is it really service, or are you just doing what you would normally do? And so it seems like there's a certain amount of humility and love that says, I am going to do this for you despite the fact it's going to cost me something. And so but that's more from the perspective of the person who's actually doing it, not from the perspective of those who are like receiving, the activity.
Yeah. I don't mind the first half of the definition. The only word I quibble with is the notion that it's rooted in humility and love rather than obligation or personal gain. Like, I'm not sure obligation is a bad thing. I think I know what he's talking about. Like someone who's doing it, because I have to. I mean, you don't want someone to do something because they have to. But there's a kind of obligation that's good, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking of Romans 13:8. Owe no one anything except to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. Like we do have an obligation to love one another, and I serve partly out of that obligation.
Yeah.
Because that's a commitment I've made to you, and I keep my commitments, and so I'm doing it for you, so it can be selfless, right? But I part of the reason why I keep showing up to serve you is because that's a commitment I make, and I owe it to you as a brother and someone who's trying to live out the kingdom together. So I'd quibble with that part of obligation, but I suspect what he means by obligation may be a little bit different than how I'm interpreted in light of Romans.
Yeah, and I would say the same thing. I think he's probably thinking of obligation. It's like, this sort of bad attitude, or I'm only doing this because I have to. If I really felt like I had a choice, I wouldn't do it. I'm with you, John. I think that there's a certain amount of obligation that grows out of love. That because I love God and because I love my brothers and sisters, I do feel a sense of obligation. And so obligation doesn't have to be viewed as a dirty word. There is a good form of it. So I think you're right. Like I said, I think I know where Foster's coming from, and I probably agree with his thought. But I don't want to limit obligation in that regard to just turn it into something bad. That there is good obligation. Like I said, that's grounded in love for God and our neighbors.
I think those are helpful insights. It's intriguing to me how differently I interpreted obligation. So I think I would affirm everything that you said. And also, I heard obligation as the difference between the intern who's going and getting coffees because they're obliged to based on their position, or the person who says, I would like to do something as an act of service to the team, and so I'm going to bring in coffee, which is a really mundane example designed hopefully not to be charged in any way. But it felt to me in my initial reading of Foster like he's trying to eliminate from the category, spiritual discipline service. He's trying to eliminate from that category the stuff you do because it's your job, or the stuff that you do because you have to do that stuff as part of a normal rhythm. But I would agree with you all as well that the way that you're describing obligation, I don't think that disqualifies the service either. But again, when I first heard this definition, I was thinking about mandatory, like the intern gets told, go get coffee, so they have to. Mm-hmm. And Foster would say, that's not really what I'm talking about. That act is not the spiritual discipline service.
So if Mother Teresa was getting paid to render the service she rendered, that wouldn't be service?
Well, I don't know that it's about the payment. And also, like another category that comes to my mind is nursing, which is just an innately service-oriented role. You're serving the patients, you're serving the doctors, you're sort of like everything you do is under as Sam kind of defined it in the beginning, it's like the category of the definition of service. And then the question becomes, okay, so what's the difference between the Christian spiritual discipline of service and the work that a person who is an RN does in like a day-to-day basis. And like I think we could intuit the difference between a nurse who is very much not there to serve and a nurse who very much is there to serve. If you've been in hospitals in any capacity, you probably have felt that difference. It's not that receiving payment disqualifies it from Christian service, but rather the intern that just does it out of a rote operational paradigm, that's a different thing even still than the person who says, I'm going to do this with a service mindset, attitude, heart, whatever, and I'm going to be the best like coffee runner I can be. That I think that sort of thing. It's not, again, like as soon as you try to be as precise as Foster has tried to be with his definition, I almost feel like you define yourself into a corner, and there's always going to be exceptions. So I don't think he's trying to say Mother Teresa collecting a paycheck renders every act of service she's done obsolete, or Calcutta didn't benefit from her Christian presence there, but rather it's again, just how I interpreted obligation was the things that you do that benefit other people don't necessarily constitute Christian service if they're just part of things you have to be doing anyway.
Yeah. I want that person who is really committed to being the best coffee runner they can be. I'd like that person working for me. That would be a fantastic service that they could render.
So
I would just remove that qualifier. That's all. I think it unnecessarily complicates it because there are too many senses in which obligation is good. Whether you're getting paid, whether you're doing it because you have to, or it's part of your job or part of your responsibility. I think it's. I'm just not sure I want to bracket all that. So I think if you just, rooted in humility and not personal gain, I think it'd be cleaner.
So your discussion made me think of so back to the Mother Teresa. Would you all say that she was engaging in the spiritual act of service, doing her daily caring for people, or was she just rendering service?
This is where,
and can they be separated?
I think what happens is we try to, like you were saying, John, we try to really accurately and precisely define things. And in so doing, we try to say this is what it's not. And we try to exclude things from the definition. And there's some value to that, but what it fails to recognize is that it's like a Venn diagram where things are overlapping. And the thing you're trying to exclude is something that overlaps into service. And so in the process of trying to precisely define it, we end up doing a poor job of defining it because we fail to recognize the overlap with other characteristics or traits or whatever. And so, doing it for no personal gain. Sorry, Larry, I know we're doing it. I know you're listening and now you're laughing at me. But just because there's personal gain in it doesn't mean that there's no service there. I don't think we can do anything without personal gain. It may be financial, but it may be very, very rewarding. It's like, I just feel good about myself. I'm so glad that I did this. That's personal gain. And I can't throw that out the window. And so there's, I know what he's trying to do there, but I'm like, but, I don't think I can throw that element out.
The reason I ask is I think of someone like Brother Lawrence practicing the presence of God. Yeah. And so he's in a monastery and he's washing dishes and he's figuring out a way. How do I turn washing dishes into an act of worship? It's an act of service too. And so these are his everyday mundane things. I don't know if it's personal gain or not. It's just expected. It's the obligation of being a monk. And yet he's figuring out a way to turn those things into something else. And I wonder where that enters into the understanding, the definition of what service is. Like, I think it's definitely possible that you could turn lots of things that are expected of you, but turn that around into the spiritual act, the spiritual discipline of service, because you just change. I think it's all just changing your perspective on what you're doing and why you're doing it. Yeah. And I think Mother Teresa is a perfect example of that. Yes, it's her quote job, and yes, it's what she does all day, every day. But it seems like she was doing it as an act of service, and in that is drawing closer to God. And so I think it's possible. I think it's hard for most of us because our jobs are what they are, right? They're to make money so that we can pay bills and all those other things. And so I don't know, a change of perspective might allow for turning that into something more. Okay.
And back to Todd.
No one agrees or disagrees. Like, whatever, Sam.
Well,
So we might just want to broaden it.
Yeah,
to
maybe
include possibly more.
Good job, Sam. Way to go.
Yeah,
You
ripping.
needed some affirmation in there. I failed to give it to you.
Yeah,
I
that's fine.
apologize for that. So, slap on the back.
Well, I
Oh.
think what Sam is raising is the center of Foster's definition, in my understanding, is rooted in humility and love, which is what John zeroed in on. Which is I think that's the operational center for him, which is part of actually. Now I'm going to do it. My objection with his definition is not that it's not a good definition. I don't even particularly mind leaving obligation in, because I think it's presenting a kind of high ideal for what the spiritual discipline of service is meant to be expressed as, like in perfection in a vacuum. But I teach this content to college freshmen, some of which do not identify as Christian even, and are coming into a class, and they might, as I would see this definition, they might come across a definition that's got selfless acts rooted in humility and love, and their first question is going to be, well, I mean, I can't do that, can I? Like, I don't have this perfectly pure heart that is perfectly capable of serving with no expectation of receiving anything in return. And so I do maybe too much work to broaden the definition as broadly as I can. And my definition I present in class is doing something for the benefit of someone else.
Yeah, it makes me think of a lot of times people are highly critical of any action that is self-serving. Like, that is a really negative term. It's a negative assessment. Like, you're just serving yourself. And so if you're serving yourself immediately, it has no redeeming value to it. And so I think it taps into that and sort of intuitive understanding that people have, that to serve, it has to be outward focused. It has to be directed towards other people. If you're just serving yourself, it's really not service at all. And it's so, yeah, I can see where that fits into that.
Is this where we rip on Todd's definition?
Go for it.
Is Larry okay with that?
Let it rip.
Yeah. I can't wait to see him after hearing this episode.
So I do appreciate you saying, yeah, you don't have to be perfect, super Christian to engage in this. But I really, like I said, I think there's a distinction between service and the spiritual discipline of service. And so for me, your definition is like tangential, if not a full foot into humanism, where like, I'm a good person because I'm a good person. But is that the spiritual discipline of it? I'm not saying in the midst of that you can't encounter God. In fact, I think probably people do, but they're not going into it with that mindset. And so that's, I just it gets a little for me a little too far away from the discipline aspect and too close to just the service aspect of it. But I do appreciate you wanting to say, yeah, you don't have to be Mother Teresa to engage in this. In fact, most of you should be doing more of it.
I'm still stuck on the obligation. I like your definition. It just reminded me of, Great Lakes has this requirement to graduate called Christian service.
Yes.
All of our students are
too.
required to put in 15 hours a semester of like service. And we've had students in the past object to it. Like, I'm not going to record my hours and turn it in, because if I did, then it wouldn't be service. If I did it, it would be out of obligation. So I am going to conscientiously abstain from this graduation requirement because they were trying to preserve something I think that Foster is trying to make integral. And I don't know if it's also trying to preserve something that you're trying to make integral, Sam, by making the spiritual discipline of service a different act than just service. That makes me nervous, because then we were talking about certain aspects of life are spiritual and some are not spiritual, or so like, what is it, like secular service versus spiritual service? That becomes tricky. I don't know. Did we ever have an episode where we talked about what makes a practice a spiritual discipline and not a spiritual discipline? What makes it an ordinary thing
Right.
versus a spirit? Because I don't think we had that conversation. But you're working with an implicit distinction there.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yep. I don't.
I am.
And I think there's a difference. I really do. And maybe we have a 13th episode that we talk about what that actually means. I don't know, but because there's a different intentionality, I think, and the spiritual disciplines are trying to accomplish something different, I think, and I could be wrong. This is not my field by any means, but when I come into it, I do see a distinction.
Yeah, I kind of want to segue into a conversation about what is spiritual discipline, but that's going to get us way off track. And so I'm going to refrain from jumping into that conversation. But it's a good one. I think you're right. I think we should have that conversation here before we're done with this series.
So if a person is a professing Christian, a practicing Christian, however that might be defined, and they attempt to do something for the benefit of somebody else, is that a non-spiritual act?
You're dragging us right back into it.
Well, just for that specific question.
Yeah.
It's a spiritual act. I don't know. It's a spiritual discipline act.
See, we can't do it without having this conversation, because I think about people who at least are functionally atheists. They don't really confess any faith in God. They might be agnostic or whatever, but they still see value in serving, and they serve. And by most definitions of service, it's service. And so once you add that word spiritual to it, we're doing the same thing, but for different reasons. Like, it's an outgrowth of our commitment to God, our commitment to Jesus, our commitment to his kingdom, our commitment to our brothers and sisters. And so we're doing the same thing, but for different reasons. And I don't know if that's even a good definition of it, but that's the first thing that comes into my mind.
I mean, we can set it to the side and just talk about being better servants. That's fine.
Well, because I think on some level, doing the same thing but for different reasons is part of what this simplified, like, kind of pared down definition is meant to do. In a classroom full of, like, roughly, I think I had 57 in my Christian faith
you
class.
were there with me.
Yeah, and it was great. They were a great class. They need to understand how to even begin.
Right.
Some of them grew up in the church. Maybe they've got a lot of categories for this, and some of what we're doing is deconstructing those categories too, so that they don't think, like the objection to outreach ministries, that I'm not allowed to record my hours, therefore they don't count if I record them or something like that. Like, we're trying to deconstruct some of that too, and so if you're doing something for the benefit of someone else with the intention of putting their needs before yours, this is the simplest way that I can describe the on-ramp to discipline. And I would add this caveat that my ultimate target, my end game, would be to land somewhere around where Foster has landed. I think that his definition is creating a high ideal that we should strive towards, that is so high that my incoming freshmen, many of them, will feel excluded by it. And so how do you start? How does a person who doesn't have a routine of spiritual discipline, of service in their life, how do they even begin? I think it starts with considering the needs of someone else before you, and then doing something about it. And I sort of present it that way in class. And I present that as a spiritual reality, which is why I sort of dragged us back into that space.
I want to read Romans 12, 1 and 2, because I think it's interesting in light of this conversation.
Can't say that for the final episode?
Well, Todd won't let us, so John may as well jump in there as well. Go for it.
I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, on the basis of God's mercy, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your, now this translation says, reasonable act of worship. And some translations say your spiritual act of service. Do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may be able to discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And this kind of, I don't know, plays in the direction of what you're talking about, Sam. Like, there is a story world that this belongs to. This reasonable act of service or spiritual act of service is caught up in a life that is striving to do the will of God, right? To do and discern the will of God. And it's part of undoing the world's trying to conform us to its vision of what it means to be human, and trying to conform us to, the image that God has given us in Christ, right? Like, so, so maybe, I don't know, if the definition is Christian service, right, as opposed to just service, would it have to be framed as a desire to be doing God's will? And does it make it a discipline that you're striving in these actions to become more someone who does God's will and is being conformed to his image? Like, is that narrative frame? Is that doing what you're trying to?
I think it's getting that direction. But yeah, because we're talking about I use this word earlier, but intentionality. Like, so you're talking about allowing young people who are not young in the faith or no faith to begin moving in that direction. That's different than asking the person who's been a Christian for 50 years what their spiritual discipline of service is like. And so I can appreciate that. And so we got to have, it's not like they're different definitions, but it's like different stages. All right, this is your elementary stage. So you're saying, do something for the benefit of someone else. Yep. Like, let's get moving that direction, because then as you do that, it begins creating in you a different understanding of humanity. And then they might start asking the question, why am I doing this? Well, let's talk about that. What does it do for you? What does it do with your relationship to God? And so for me, it's not necessarily definitions as much as, like I said, stages and what it looks like for different people.
Yeah, you just described that much better than I did. I would just have completely jump on that bandwagon. That's exactly what I mean.
Yeah, and what I like about what you're saying there, Sam, is it's all about that framing, because the act itself is going to look very similar to non-Christian acts of service. Like, we're not trying to define the act itself, but we frame it in a context where it begins with what God has taught us, and it has objectives that are different as well. So I think that framing is an important part of it.
I have a small segue.
Yeah,
that I think is relevant. And I'm sorry to keep dragging us back to this, but I think it's germane to service in particular because, again, in the context of freshmen coming out of high school and into the college environment, they have National Honor Societies,
right.
They have service requirements in some of their secular high schools even. So what exactly are we talking about when we say service? Because categories already exist for them that may have to be reordered, dismantled even, or whatever. So the shift for me then is where Foster's wants to change service from acts to like a heartbeat, kind of a lifestyle. I'm putting some words in his mouth a little bit, but he says the true practice of the spiritual discipline of service is about cultivating a lifestyle of servanthood rather than performing occasional acts of service. That's how he describes it.
Yeah, and for me, that's what transitions to a discipline, is that you're trying to change who you are in light of who God is, as opposed to I'm trying to meet some requirement of some organization. And I do like that quite a bit about, a lifestyle of servanthood. Like, that's who we want to be. I mean, that's what the school is about. We're training up servant leaders in the church and the world. And so the discipline, in the same way that I'm disciplined in, I want to become a track star, I'm going to be disciplined and run a lot, right? And so if we want to grow up into who God has created us to be, then we need to actively seek out opportunity to serve. And then that way we slowly become servants.
Yeah, and I think discipline language still applies when it's at the infancy stages.
Sure.
Because discipline is what a coach does to a player to turn them into a good player.
Right.
The whole process is discipline, but you're further along. You don't need the coach anymore. It's become, a self-motivated discipline and not it needs to be imposed. And I feel like that's what the school does in having the requirement. It's like, you have to show up to practice, right? To get to a place if you want to play in the game. And, we're causing people to practice who wouldn't practice otherwise. And there are going to be some students that we don't need to cause. Like, they're already, because of who they are as a believer, active servants in the church. And some students, they just, I do this at my church every week. That's going to be more than enough hours. And for them, it's just a piece of paper to fill out. So I think, they're both serving, and one's further along in the journey.
What?
Yeah, I wish I'd seen that earlier. I think it gets towards the distinction I'm trying to make, and I appreciate that. Foster's the best, man. You hear that? You hear that, Larry? The best. The best, Jerry. The best.
The best, Jerry.
Well, and I think at the core, this is my understanding. I'm just speaking as Todd, not channeling Foster. The way that we develop a lifestyle of servanthood, or what lifestyle of servanthood even means, is elevating the needs of other people in your life. Not I'm nothing and I should never take care of myself, but we have this disposition, many of us have this disposition already that says I'm important and I need to take care of myself. Everybody else needs to be elevated to, in my reading of the New Testament, slightly above that level, without lowering myself and making myself unimportant, but everybody else needs to be, in a fairly direct way, more important than me. We outdo each other with love and good deeds, that whole paradigm. And so when speaking with students who are trying to understand the difference between the National Honor Society and what we're doing, for the benefit of someone else, in my definition, is carrying the freight of how are you thinking about other people in your orbit and the people that you encounter and interact with. Are you considering that they have needs, or are you just living a life of selfishness concerned with your own needs and wants? And I think the first step is doing something for the benefit of somebody else leads you, stage language, let's use that because that was helpful earlier. The first stage as you're entering into this discipline is just becoming aware that you're not an isolated person. They're not automatons, these people in your life. They're not robots. They're other people that are complex and have needs too. So you start to develop awareness of those needs and do practical steps to meet those needs. And that develops into something like what Foster described, where you are selflessly serving in humility and love and trying to avoid the personal gain accolades component, which might corrupt it, but just doing what they need because you love them.
Yeah, you had a question earlier in the paper that says, what's the connection between service and submission? And for me, you're getting at service and submission, quite honestly, are pushing back against the selfish nature, right? Which we're all like, that's who we are, right? We're selfish people. And so by actively seeking to help other people and put other people first, you're pushing back against that. Because, in our world, that's not how it works. And so I appreciate that's so vital for everyone, but like for these early stages when we have students come in and like they're out to get theirs. And so you're saying, maybe that's not the way to go. Maybe here's a thing. And just like, what would it look like to actually put someone first? How does it, does it hurt you in any way? No, it probably doesn't. So I appreciate what you just said about that whole idea of, it's just pushing back against who we kind of are without God.
So I think we're on the same page of what service is.
Amen.
Maybe even as a spiritual discipline. So we don't have to wait till the final episode.
Yeah, right.
What do you guys see as, obstacles? Because I think lots of people, Christians, would say, yeah, I want to be a servant. I want to, love my neighbor as myself. And I realize that regular service is part of that. What keeps us from living out our best intentions?
Well, I think it's already been addressed a little bit, is that self-centeredness. It's that service often requires us to deny ourselves, to say, there's something really important I want to do with my time in this moment or with my energy or my resources. And instead of being able to do what I want, I need to give that up in order to serve the people around me. And so I think that's one of the challenges we face. It's that willingness to say, as much as I have things that are important to me as a person, what I really value is serving God, serving my brothers and sisters, representing the kingdom in a very tangible way. And to say that priority forces me to turn my back on things that are important to me at times so that I can perform a service to my neighbor. And so I think that would be that would be one of the big obstacles that all of us have to learn to overcome.
I think you're exactly right. And put maybe a different shade on it. It's about prioritizing.
Yeah.
And we typically prioritize our own things going on. And so, a service project comes up in the church. Well, I'd like to go, but I need to mow my grass because it's getting pretty long, and I got this, and I got this. And so it's not that they're terrible things.
Right.
We're not screw those dudes, they can suffer. That's not our attitude. But at the same time, we immediately think, well, what do I need to get done for the sake of my family, for the sake of my job, for the sake of whatever? And the priority of the serving gets pushed further and further down. And that's tough to overcome.
It is. I agree. It's a good example.
I had an elder at a church who was really fond of pointing out the sun stand still story, where God created more time in order to accomplish the purposes that
I wish.
Right? Something like that. He was such an inspiration to me. He operated with this earnest belief that if I commit myself to the things that I believe that God is inviting me to do right now, whatever is left over, the remainder of work, you might say, is going to get done. There is going to be enough time. I'm either going to work a little bit harder, or God's going to enable something or create some space for me. Like, for him, service was an act of faith. It was an act of trust that God was going to show up, and that God might make the sun stand still so that you can get everything done that needs to get done. I am so inspired by that. I long to live with that conviction, and have tried. And I found when I commit myself in that faith, it works. He was right. It is effective. And I want to to give him the credit for that. I don't know if I don't want to make him blush, but I'm talking about Fred Korn. If any of my Kansas people know who I'm talking about, huge influence in my understanding about service and about how to prioritize the needs of other people. I think that the biggest obstacle in this paradigm would be a lack of trust that God is going to help you get all of those things done, or a lack of confidence or faith that the priorities will be set correctly and you'll get through.
It's a very Sabbath way of viewing it, that God is going to provide for you. You just got to trust him. I love that. That challenges me. Just sitting here, I'm like, wow, I think you're right. There are some ways where I haven't trusted God enough. And so you're right. We've got to put our trust in God to say, I'm going to obey. And I love you, and I love my neighbors. So I'm going to do this, God. I'm going to trust that the things that I'm setting aside are going to be taken care of. Wow. I think that's a great challenge.
That approach he has is an approach I try to do, although I haven't. It's funny, he links it to God making the sun stand still. The way I articulate it, and it's similar to that in that just like, if I devote my time during the day to this, the sun is going to like disappear at night and the rest of society is going to shut down and I'm just going to have to stay up later. Right. I'm going to lose sleep basically. And there's usually the stuff I need to be done. I can push some of it later into the night, and it helps that I'm a night person. But I think a day person can wake up early the next day, and so the faith thing for me is that I'm not going to get a good night's sleep tonight because I devoted time to this thing that I didn't really have time for. And my prayer every time I do that, as I go to bed, Lord, make this night of sleep that's only 3 hours be as if it were 8, so that I can be refreshed, to tend to the things that I need to be devoted to tomorrow. And it is amazing how often he answers that prayer with a great deal of energy and refreshment. And it's not quite the sun standing still, but it's adjacent to that in a way that relies upon God to do that. When I think about obstacles, I just finished working through a book called Restless Devices by Felicia Wu Song. It is a phenomenal book that will ruin your life. Because she talks about the digital world as not just a bunch of tools that you can use, and you can use them in bad ways or you can use them in good ways. She talks about the digital ecology, the digital ecosystem, and how the phones, the devices, the streaming programs, the movies, that when you're done, it already is firing up the next movie to kind of link you to the next one, or the YouTube video. A friend recommends a video and you watch it, haha, it was funny for 30 seconds, but then automatically spins up the next video. And then I think part of the link to the enemy of service being time, which I think has come up in a few ways with all of us, is there's this digital ecosystem I'm agreeing with Song's book that I think she's right on, that it malforms us to be people who are less devoted to real, actual people, because we have less time for it, because they use our time, because they want to keep us hooked so they can keep pushing their advertisements on us and the other worldview shaping propaganda that they have. But they also foster in us, like, how we get our emotional needs met. I think in a life of service, like, your endorphin hits and your rush and your energy comes from laying down your life for others, and what God does and how he blesses you and how other people bless you when you serve them. Like, the digital ecosystem is meeting those needs in other ways. And so that I think there's something about our enslavement to an ecosystem that is malforming us away from a culture of service, that at least that book has me thinking that could be relevant.
Well, that's not the only book out there, too, because you and I were just talking about one, Todd, that it's probably not saying the same thing, but it seems like it's a very similar message. And so, yeah, I think that for all of us, turning away from whether it be the TVs or the phones or whatever, and looking out towards people, to look out our windows and our front doors and walk down the street and see them. is to break from that pattern. And I think it's an important component of getting us back into that mindset of serving.
Yeah, I think what you said about the physical chemical reaction to service, I think almost everyone I know would agree. Going on service trips, and it may not be at Hawaii, but maybe other places where it's like terrible conditions, and you come back and you're like, that was amazing. Yeah, I was sleeping on the floor, and there were cockroaches, and there were this and that, and yet it was still amazing. Why? Because we saw life change, right? We saw people impacted, and so I think that's a fantastic point. That's how I think it partly offsets the drudgery of sometimes how we feel about service, and maybe that's another obstacle, is that there's a association with it that it's just like this again. But when we actually get on the other side of like, yeah, I'm glad I did that. That was worth doing, even if our attitude wasn't great going in.
Yeah, this again, it reminded me, I was having a conversation with a brother at church who is a very funny person, and we were just talking about technology. We were talking about this book a little bit, and how we got to the point where we consider serving a drudgery, right? And the point he made is, when we're on our phones and we're watching the stand-up comedians, right, and the little clips that are actually hysterical, right, and they are funny over the top, and we get the greatest hits of people's humor at our fingertip, and then you have someone in the body of Christ who's a genuinely funny and witty person who says something genuinely funny and witty, and we can't laugh at them. It's an eye roller. It's a, that's like probably the funniest person who said a very funny thing, and you're so desensitized to humor that you don't get to laugh with them and appreciate, God has this humorous person in your life, because they just don't seem funny compared to the greatest hits online. And I think there are lots of kind of ripple effects to that, like how we get desensitized to how cool people are that we might be serving, and how much that might fill us up, because the people in our life just can't compare to the people on the screen.
I encourage everybody to take a look at the research that's out there about how screens are changing our neurochemistry. It's a budding field, and there's a lot of good work being done on that. It's kind of terrifying. Ruin your life is exactly the way I would describe it. Can I make some practical suggestions before we wrap up?
Please
Yeah.
do.
You're in charge.
Okay, I've got three things I want to suggest, and I'm going to hit them fairly quickly. If you show up into a new situation, you should only say exactly 4 words. How can I help? And then stop talking and listen to what they say, and then go do it. If you want to know, how do I be a better servant? How do I have a servant's heart? Let go of control. Show up into a new situation, project at work, whatever, church thing. How can I help? Stop talking. Then go put your hands to work. Okay. Service doesn't have to be something that you hate doing. I knew a software engineer who felt that he wanted to engage in serving more. And so he found a nonprofit that was relying on software engineers to write code and process data to do things like well surveying in parts of the world that struggle to get access to water. So he donated his time and service doing something he really enjoys, writing code. And I would consider that a distinct act of Christian service. And then lastly, we have this strange tendency as humans to take for granted the people that are closest to us. And usually this manifests in our marriages and our families, the people that we share space with in our homes. If you want to cultivate a heart of service, I don't actually suggest that you go out and find some anonymous person to serve. I think the first person that you should start serving is the person that you live with, because you will receive no accolades for that. Just becoming a more servant-minded person at home and taking better care of your family, better care of your spouse, better care of your roommates, that is cultivating a humble heart of service that will not get you recognition. So those are my 3. Those are my suggestions.
Great suggestions.
Yeah. Is that it?
Any you guys would add?
Why
I
would we
would
want to
say-
improve on that?
I mean-
think Todd did a great job.
The how can I help? Like, just do it. Like, stop explaining it away or whatever. Just go do things, and that'll get you moving in the right direction. I kind of with all the disciplines. Like, I don't know how to pray. We'll start. And anyway.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us for another episode of the After Class Podcast.
After class, because
The best conversations happen
After class?
Thank you again for listening to this episode of the After Class Podcast. ACP is hosted by Sam Long, John Nugent, and Ron Peters. Social media pictures and descriptions are provided by Darren Harris. Audio mixing and editing is done by Drew Nyquist. If you've enjoyed this episode of ACP, you might also enjoy GLCC's Master of Arts in Practical Theology degree. In this 36-hour program, you will receive first-rate biblical and theological instruction from John, Ron, Sam, and several of their colleagues at Great Lakes Christian College. To learn more about this program, visit glcc.edu. Get practical and go deep at GLCC.